then there's modeling. Everyone's used to models for physical things like cars and buildings and so on. But quite a few years ago, we started experimenting with modeling software. And the general idea was that, as designers, there's a lot of things we have to try out, like interactions and even visual design. And you just don't want to have to code it. You just want to be able to quickly try it out, see if it's working, and then move on to something else. And so we started thinking, what could we do? Because, this was way back in 2005, actually, that we started this. So very old phones back then, and things were new. I mean, right now you can prototype all sorts of things in all sorts of neat ways, but 2005 you couldn't do very much. So we were trying to conceptualize some kind of children's learning software type stuff for a PlayStation Portable. And of course, you couldn't get stuff onto the PlayStation Portable very easily. I think you needed a license back then. I mean, so what do you do to prototype it? So what we came up with was, in some ways, the simplest thing we could think of. We made some screens to show the application and to show all the different states of the application. So in this case, there were about 10 different screens. And then we put it in the native image viewer. So basically, almost any phone, and you can still do this today, almost any device has an image viewer, and you can use it full screen most of the time. And usually, when it's full screen, you can then use, whatever the native controls are to go back and forth throughout it. And amazingly, it kind of works. You can start to at least kind of play with the app a little bit. It's really rudimentary. You can only kind of go back and forth. But if you have 10 pictures, you can go from the first one to the second one to the third one, and you can start to kind of model things. And the thing is, this takes minutes, right? So, okay, it's not perfect, not even close to perfect, but it does something that you couldn't have done otherwise. And we actually used this idea kind of for years on different devices, and eventually we started actually stringing these together using code so that you could actually add interactivity. And what you inevitably end up with is something kind of like this. And EdgeCase, right after me, is going to talk about a tool that they made that's strikingly similar. This is one from Nokia, and it's basically an evolution of what we were doing before with graphics, where you load in a whole bunch of images that you've just made in Photoshop or wherever you make them. They can be really simple. These ones are kind of complicated looking, but they can be little sketch drawings that you've scanned. And then you start assigning relationships and behaviors to them. And so basically, you say, okay, well, when you're on this one and you press on that, it'll bring you here. And then maybe there's a back button here, so if you press on that one, it'll bring you back here. And you start kind of making a model of the software. But again, just using pictures, there's no real functionality. But it's amazing. You can hand it to people, and they can start doing little things. And we used this system for a couple large projects last year, where we had conference calls with engineers on the other side of the world, and we had made these little models. And as we were talking to them, we'd be quickly fixing them up, and then we'd send another jar file across, and they'd put it on their phone, and they'd play with it, and then they'd say, I don't know about this, and then they'd tell us what to do, and we'd send it back. And you can do some really, really rapid prototyping with stuff like this. And you can use it with users. Again, very limited. You have to kind of frame the testing session so that they understand it's not a real app. But you can actually learn a lot, and takes very little time. And so you'll see more about that later. And then the last thing that we do quite a bit as well, and it's becoming even more relevant now, of course, but we also use HTML, even for native apps. And this was a project about 2 years ago. Intel started building a Linux-based operating system for what they called MIDs, which was mobile internet devices, which is kind of a cross between a high-end smartphone and a tablet. And there were no MIDs really at that point. There was one, which was the Nokia N900, which was kind of the closest. And this operating system was going to be for Linux, so this wasn't the device. But we still needed to have something to prototype on, and we needed about the right size, kind of the right form factor, because there was a keyboard issue. And and there were no phones, there was no operating system yet. There was just us with some wireframes. And the wireframes were driving us crazy because we couldn't tell if we actually had enough room on screen to do all this stuff, whether it was going to completely not make sense, whether it got on the phone. So we just made a prototype out of HTML. And in this case, it was just a design prototype. All we really cared about is, do we have enough room? Do we have enough room to put folders and filters side by side and still be able to press it because it needs to be big enough for press states? When the keyboard pops up, because it was a virtual keyboard idea, is it going to hide most of the screen? You're not going to be able to see anything. Can we get a full keyboard on here? and actually still see the email that you're typing underneath. And so that's all we wanted to prototype. That's all we cared about. And HTML was good enough, right? I mean, so don't be scared to use whatever you can think of to prototype. It doesn't mean that if you're doing an iPhone app, you have to prototype in that environment at all. If you can solve little problems by doing something completely unconventional, why not, right? So it's all about experimentation and doing whatever works for you. So I'm almost done. So design doesn't have to be stressful. And the main, number 5 is not much of a number 5, but actually this is really, really important because people get really stressed out. They're like, user experience, oh no, we have to do user experience. And then they look online and they see this big process thing and they're like, oh, okay, I don't know what to do. And there's actually, what it really amounts to is get to know your customers, your existing ones and your past ones and your future ones, get to know what their problems are and start to think about what they need. And then just go make something really wonderful and, take your time and think about, who you're going to make happy with whatever it is you're making, basically. And that's it.
Thanks, Effie. Well, I'm going to take a couple of questions right now because, and then we'll be passing on to Paul, who has got, again, picking up on what Stephanie has highlighted there. It's kind of what they develop, issues as well for that development. It'll be quite good to see.
Any questions? Yes.
Whenever we've done prototyping, what we found was that customers start complaining because they think they've got a finished app. And then when you actually start developing, it goes back so far. I was just wondering whether you found that if you do work with clients, that the prototyping can kind of, although it's incredibly useful, like you said, it can be quite dangerous when working outside of your team.
It is, and I mean, it's kind of a perpetual struggle because, I mean, what we try to do is only show them enough of what we need to solve whatever problem that prototype is trying to solve. So rather than build the whole thing into a prototype, if we're just trying to nail down, how does the interaction work to get from the photo client down into the photo editing bit, down into some other bit. And so we just prototype that little bit. But I admittedly, it really is a challenge because sometimes if you use kind of nice visual design for the prototype, it feels like an app, and so they think it's almost done. And if you use really sketchy kind of boxes and squares, and to make it look really, really rough, so you can say to them, okay, look, this is just a prototype, then they can't imagine it as much because it's too rough, right? And so it's finding that weird little middle ground. And we still haven't really found an answer for that. Other than, I think the only thing I will say is if you do lots of small prototypes, lots and lots and lots of them, after a while, they do kind of sink in that, oh yeah, right now we're just talking about this little bit, and they don't really think about it as much as a big one. And that's where some of the really rapid, what EdgeCase is going to talk about, I mean, that type of tool, we had one project where we used it throughout, and we ended up making, I think in the end, about 50 prototypes. I mean, literally everything, every little thing we would try to solve, we made a small prototype for. And then occasionally we would take 3 or 4 of the small ones and bunch them together into a slightly larger one. But we ended up prototyping the whole app bit by bit by bit. And at the end, we just documented what we had prototyped and gave that to the engineers. And that actually worked quite well. And nobody really, everyone, no one really thought that these were actually real because we were doing it in such small chunks. But it's definitely challenging, though. There's still that issue of if it looks too finished, then it feels finished. And then if it doesn't, it's hard.
When the final app looks worse than the prototype, then I just get in Photoshop with lots of much shading.
Yeah. And that's the other danger as well, is who do you get to do your artwork for the prototype is a bit of a problem too. Because if you get people who don't understand mobile, they'll kind of bump it up to make it look nice. And then, well, you can't do that shading effect and you can't do this transparency and, so yeah. Any other questions?
One of the things, I was going to ask a question because one of the things that we obviously get, even people in the audience today, will be looking to take an application or an idea or a concept to, kind of go into coding, so it's physically, a physical device. What's your experience on, taking a step, slightly before that and actually pitching something to an investor that is more kind of picture-based?
Yeah, actually, one of the types of prototypes that I didn't put in here because well, because of the audience, but also there's so many other types of prototypes we've experimented with. But what you can do is something, there's different names for it, but it's called a vision prototype isn't a bad idea. And that's actually really useful for things like investors and so on, or situations where you need to convince an investor or a bunch of analysts. I mean, a while ago we did some work with Symbian where they were trying to conceptualize the latest version of Symbian, and this was months before there were any public drawings or anything being released. But they wanted to stimulate conversation, and so we just kind of made up Symbian in a video. But it got 80,000 views on YouTube, and people started talking about it, and a lot of people started criticizing it, but at least it got the conversation going, right? So sometimes you can actually do something that's just meant to stimulate conversation, or just meant to get a stakeholder to buy into something so that you can then do something else. So no code at all, and not even any interactivity, just kind of giving you the idea of the product. I mean, in some ways, it's kind of the way Apple pitches some of the stuff that it's about to release, by making you want it before you really quite know what it is, right? And to me, that's still a prototype in the sense that you're solving a problem, you're moving ahead in some way, but and you also get input about features, you get all sorts of stuff from something like that, but it's not a traditional prototype.